Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about group radicalization and these implications for self-radicalization. So when we talk about these issues, as the title of this conference suggests, we talk a lot about what's going on in somebody's brain, what's going on with that person, whether it's their narrative, whether it's something in their life. In the area where I work, which has to do a lot with countering violent extremism, trying to stop people from becoming extremists, we tend to focus on these individuals in a very big way, and sometimes we miss some of the dynamics that are happening around the groups. So my question that sort of developed out of a paper I wrote recently for ICCT. You can find it on their website. There will be some charts in here that you don't have to worry about capturing. You can go on the website and get them off the paper if you want to. But to me, rather than necessarily asking why people radicalize, why people take part in this violence, a question that occurred to me is, why do groups radicalize, and then why do people join those groups? Why do they affiliate with those groups? And I will come back to the brains, though, and the individual after talking a little bit about this broader question. So in writing the paper that inspired a lot of this presentation, I looked at the history of a white nationalist movement called Christian Identity. It's an American movement. It stemmed from a British historical conspiracy theory from the 1800s called British Israelism, which was a theory that the British were the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. So it was just sort of a way to dress up Great Britain, to make it to describe the British Empire as the recipients of prophecies. It was the recipient of God's blessing, and they've got a piece of the chosen people. And this was fairly innocuous at first. I mean, there's sort of a latent anti-Semitism built into it, in that these guys were Christians and they expected that Jews would eventually have to recognize the correctness of Christianity and join up. But they didn't have an anti-Semitic agenda, and they had warm feelings toward Jews. And over the course of 100 years, a lot of different influences, including one that was mentioned earlier today, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion conspiracy theory, worked their way into British Israelism. And so over the course of many texts, British Israelism started to become more extreme. So at first it started to have a more negative attitude towards Jews. And then it started to take on an apocalyptic dimension where they saw Jewish people as part of a threat to human history. And finally, it became a violent extremist movement. It finally morphed into Christian identity over the course of this time. And you can trace that progression in its texts. So my approach to this was to look at ideology. And when I'm talking about ideology, I'm talking about the explanation that an extremist group has for who's in the group and who's out of the group. They have to describe each of those groups so that you know who to kill and who to hug. And so these descriptions have to be conveyed somehow. So it's not just something that you wake up knowing. Somebody has to explain it to you. So they explain it in books. The British Israelists wrote a lot of books. They were very prolific. Articles, lectures, pamphlets, videos, conversations, and today we see this kind of stuff happening in tweets. So all of these texts are what makes up ideology. You don't really have an ideology if you don't have some form of one of these texts. One of the things, when I approached this, what I really wanted to do is to study this movement, study its texts, and then create a theory out of that. So it's a grounded theory approach. And rather than going into it with a preconceived idea of what I wanted to say. So what I found in looking at this, and I think that there's probably validity in this for other extremist groups, and I'll be exploring that in subsequent publications, is identity-based movements, when you're talking about in-groups and out-groups in this sociological sense. Who's in my in-group? Who are my friends? Who's my tribe? Who's in the out-group? Who are our enemies? Who's the foreign tribe? All of these movements are based on the idea of establishing the legitimacy of the collective group. And what happens, identity collectives in general are not necessarily negative. So the British Israelists really weren't extremists. They were trying to prop up British identity, but they weren't doing it at the expense of someone else. So what happened over time as the movement became extreme is that this demand for legitimacy became greater and greater. And after a while, they could only satisfy that demand by taking legitimacy away from another group. So as their demands for legitimacy grew, it wasn't enough that they were the lost tribes of Israel. Then they had to delegitimize the people who were currently existing as Israel, the Jews. They had to take their legitimacy away in order to enhance the legitimacy of Anglo-Saxons. So all of this sort of led me to a definition of extremism that I'm going to be using in this. One problem that we have in my field, which is studying violent extremism, is that there aren't real good consensus definitions of our terms. So everybody has a different one they use. I'm not satisfied with a lot of them. Some of them are very circular. They say extremism is the adoption of extreme ideas, and that's not really useful. If you look at some of the British countering violent extremism programs, they defined extremism as being antithetical to British values, but British values are a moving target. They're not one thing. So for me, what I came to conclude after reading this is that extremism is when you believe that your in-group, your tribe, your organization, your religion, can only succeed if you take negative actions against an out-group, somebody who's not in your tribe or existence. So if you can't separate the idea of the health of the in-group from negative actions taken against the out-group, that means you're an extremist. If you can't separate your own in-group success from violence against an out-group, that makes you a violence extremist. And then radicalization is a very contested term in our field. And so in my context, we're talking about radicalization as a process, not necessarily as a product. So you don't simply become radicalized. It's a process of things that happen to you. And when I use the term, what I'm saying is that it's the escalation of an extremist movement's orientation through the adoption of increasingly negative views about the outgroup and the endorsement of increasingly hostile action against the outgroup. There's a couple of advantages to this, just in my context, because a lot of what's been written about these organizations, about terrorism, about violent extremism, has been very heavily based on jihadist activity for reasons that are probably obvious. But what I'm interested in doing is talking about this in a context that goes a little bit beyond that and is a bit more robust, because we can see commonalities between white nationalism and jihadism. We understand they're both extremist movements, and we don't have good tools to talk about how they're similar to each other. So the British Israelists were prolific writers. They wrote just hundreds of books, of which I read dozens, and out of all that massive material, which is, some of which is very, very unreadable, I will tell you, what I found was that, you know, they built an identity for the in-group. Identity for the in-group, you know, starts off as something obvious. So I live in America, so I'm an American, right? So that's kind of an easy thing. But then what does it mean to be an American? So over the course of time, people who live in the same community, who are part of a tribe, who have the same skin color and want to talk about that as their community, eventually have to describe the in-group, and that description has components. So one component is belief. So, you know, we're Christians, so we believe that Jesus died for our sins. Beliefs are something you directly experience. Out of all this stuff, it's the thing that is most directly controllable by the individual. When you describe what you believe, you know what you believe. Almost everything else is mediated, so it's information that's coming to you from other sources. So when you hear these things, they may be a mix of truth and fiction. When you hear about the beliefs of the outgroup, those are as you understand them. So if you are following any kind of discussion about Islam in the public sphere, you will certainly know that there is a great deal of disagreement about what Islam believes, what it doesn't. And when you're an anti-Muslim extremist group member, as we have quite a few of in the United States, your understanding of the beliefs of Islam are mediated by a description. So you have a view of what those are, and they're derived usually from secondhand knowledge. In addition to beliefs, there are traits that gets into kind of this intrinsic question of like what it is to be an American, what it is to be a white person. Traits, you know, can be like, oh, well, we're courageous, or we're smart, or you know, any kind of trait that sort of gets to your intrinsic self as a member of this identity group. And these are extremely subjective. And then finally, there's practices, and practices tend to be more important in understanding why groups become violent, because they adopt understandings about what the other group's doing. So I'm an American, and I have a view about Canadians. As long as I'm thinking about what Canadians believe, I'm thinking about what their traits are, I'm not likely to get that worked up about it. When I think about what Canadians are doing, then I might get concerned. If I think Canadians are out to destroy America, then I might be more likely to become a violent extremist. So practices breaks up into three categories: past, present, and future. Past is history. It's extremely subjective. In the evolution of British Israelism, they rewrote their histories over and over again. It's very fluid. Present practices, partly you experience that directly. I live in America, so I kind of know what Americans do, but also I have a perception about what Americans do because I don't know all Americans. And then expectations about the future, and depending on what kind of movement you're in, those can be analytical, like we've thought about the future and this is what's going to happen in the future, or they can be religious. They can be based on prophecy and have an apocalyptic dimension, which can take you in a very serious direction. So the past, present, future piece of this, when you're building your in-group and out-group identities, the more robust these descriptions get, the more vulnerable they are to extremism. So if you're in a movement, an identity movement, say you're the Black Panthers, it's not necessarily the best example because there's a lot of overlap, but you're dealing with Black Panthers. It's the 1960s in the United States, and you're dealing with an atmosphere of discrimination that's happening around you. So you're focused on the present. When you start to develop that identity, when you start to go into other kinds of Black nationalist movements that have very elaborate histories, some of which are very similar to British Israelism, actually. Some people believe that, you know, Africans are descended from the lost tribes of Israel. The more you build out these identities, the more robust the description is, and the more problematic it is to try and argue against it. This is a chart that's in the paper. I wouldn't worry about capturing it, but there's my reading of this is that it's basically there are two parallel tracks, and I call this the ladder of identity construction. So the parallel tracks are the in-group identity, which is beliefs, behavior, past behavior, intrinsic, who we are, kind of definition, and future expectations. And there's a parallel track for the out-group. So when you start off building an identity collective, okay, we're Americans, and you start off by building that, you're concerned with defining that in-group. But as the group becomes more extreme, if it's going to move into extremism, then you have to define the out-group. And you do that on a parallel track. You use the same tools to build out a history and an expectation. So in between those two lines is a question of sourcing, and sourcing is different. So this is where we really start to fill in the contents of an ideology. So the argument I'm making here is that ideologies have common structures, common themes, and that what you fill up that structure with is what's different from one group to another. That's what differentiates white nationalism from jihadism, from any other kind of nationalism. So those sources can include your direct experience, but more often they're going to include secondhand information. You're going to get your news from the internet maybe these days. You getting something out of your scriptures, sources from your scriptures. You're hearing folklore. The British Israelites really love to find obscure little pieces of folklore and turn them into evidence that the British were actually the lost tribes. Conspiracy theories. All this stuff goes in to building both sides of the identity. So this diagram is something that was developed by a colleague of mine at ICCT, Hororo Ingram. And when he talks about extremist group propaganda, he talks about this kind of framing. So the framing is, there's an out-group that's responsible for a crisis, which is afflicting the in-group. The in-group provides a solution to the crisis. So there's, okay, we're gonna fight in a jihad, or we're gonna do something else. The solution controls the out-group, and so it's a circle of linkages, and this was developed with an eye toward doing counter-messaging. We're gonna do propaganda that tries to undermine these linkages. I have taken his diagram and I've added another category to it. This is based on an analysis of ISIS propaganda. So there are two kinds of extremist in-groups. There's an eligible in-group, which is, in the case of ISIS, is Sunni Muslims, and then there's the extremist in-group, which means you're part of the Islamic State itself. So the addition to the circle is that the extremist in-group is trying to convince the eligible in-group to join, and that's, in terms of trying to devise counter-messaging, that's a very important linkage to try and attack. So the brains, we get back to the brains that pull the triggers. How does the individual interact with these groups? So the paper from which this is drawn is, I've been working with elements of social identity theory, which is where these terms in-group and out-group come from. And one finding that was fairly early in the process of social identity theory was that just picking a group, just assigning yourself to a group, increases the possibility that you will feel prejudice against an out-group, or you'll feel stereotypes about people who are not in the group. And then more recent research by Michael Hogg has really kind of put an empirical spin on this, and it talks about the adoption of group identity, and particularly extremist groups, as a tactic to reduce feelings of uncertainty about oneself and about one's own identity. And that's where all these preceding constructions come in. When you build a really robust story of who you are, who your in-group is, that can help resolve uncertainty. So my feeling is, and we're going to start to move here into outside the scope of the paper that I wrote and into the area of papers that I'm going to write. So I reserve the right to change some of these conclusions, but I wanted to push the envelope, as we were urged to do, and I wanted to try and bring this to the individual level, to talk about the brains, to talk about the minds, and how people interact with this. So one thing we see when we talk about, who joins an violent extremist group, famously there is no single profile. There's a lot of different profiles. There are things that we see more often among extremists than in the general population. But when you go to look at the big population of people who have those traits, it's not useful in trying to identify who might become an extremist. So to pick one off of here, converts. In jihadist movements, converts are disproportionately represented, especially in Western countries. But there's still only a tiny, tiny percentage of converts actually join a jihadist movement. So what does this tell us? We look at all these factors, and all these factors are things that people like to talk about in terms of extremism, and many of them have been disproven on a big scale as being factors that drive people to extremism. So I have a lot of friends and interactions with people in the US State Department, or the previous US State Department, and they love economic factors. They want to say, people need jobs. If they had good jobs, they wouldn't join extremist groups. That doesn't hold up very well. What we do see is that people have some kind of disruptive experience in their life sometimes before joining an extremist movement. So loss of a job, a change that creates uncertainty. You've lost your job and you're uncertain about what's going to happen next. Loss of a loved one. We have a couple, there are a number of cases where we've seen somebody go through a painful divorce, or they have a loved one die, a wife or parents die. Exposure to violence can increase uncertainty in your life. If you're in an environment where you're at risk, where you've experienced danger. Relocation, we see that especially with some of the young recruits to groups like ISIS, people who have been moved to the United States and have not done well with the adjustment. Some kinds of mental illness can lead to uncertainty. So, and these are all traits that we see in different extremist groups, and we also see them in some cases when we look at like mass killers, like a mass shooter in the United States. All of these different things are sociologically and personally many different kinds of experiences, but they can all contribute to uncertainty. They put you in a mode of questioning who you are. They put you in a mode of questioning, what am I going to do next? So there's also macro sources of uncertainty, which sources of uncertainty to make whole populations experience uncertainty and have doubt. War, insurgency, rapid changes in demographics, which may be responsible for some of what we're seeing in the United States and Europe right now in terms of the rise of far-right movements. Rapid changes in civil society. We saw spikes in white nationalist violence during the civil rights movement in the United States. Watershed changes in communication technology. So, you know, the internet has rapidly changed the way we interact with each other, how we meet each other. I will talk about contagion a little bit more in a bit, because I know Itzhak really wants me to. And we get more information. So now it's like, you know, well, I want to look up information about vaccines. It's like it used to be, go to your doctor tells you, get a vaccine, get your kids vaccinated, they're going to be healthy. Now you go on the internet, and suddenly you've got giant movements devoted to saying that vaccines cause autism, so that's creating uncertainty, and some people were having a couple of measles outbreaks because some people believe that. Efforts to foment uncertainty by state actors. So here I am talking about the recent well-publicized efforts of the Russians to pump disinformation into Western social circles on the internet, on social media and mainstream media. It is not coincidental that a lot of the Russian propaganda efforts are devoted to boosting up far-right extremist movements by creating uncertainty. And economic upheaval. So this is something that needs to be fully examined. I'm not making this as a flat assertion, but the link between violent extremism and bad economic conditions has been pretty conclusively disproven. However, what I think has not been looked at enough is whether changes in economic circumstances, dramatic changes where a whole lot of money comes in, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, for instance, a few years back, or where there was a whole lot of money and now there's not. And so just to sort of hit that point, we have this intuitive idea that, you know, a lot of people have this intuitive idea, particularly in government and development circles. Lack of economic opportunity leads to extremism. That doesn't seem to be the case. Research doesn't support it. Lack of educational opportunity, research doesn't support it. Things that are predictable are not necessarily going to contribute to uncertainty. So if you live in a corrupt regime, and it's been corrupt for 50 years, and the kind of corruption that exists is the same as it's always been, that's not necessarily going to create uncertainty. It's not necessarily going to spawn extremism. What happens is when things change, when the rules suddenly change, so it used to be that you paid this bribe once a month and everything was fine, your store got to stay open. Now all of a sudden everything's different. Now they want more money. They're not coming around at all anymore. I think that a lot of these factors that people gravitate toward to try and explain extremism can be better understood in the context of creation of uncertainty. So I am not a neuroscientist, and this is not by any means a thorough or rigorous discussion of this. It is more of a starting point for how I want to look at the individual. So all of these big macro factors, all of these narratives, all of this conversation, how does it affect people? So there's some research, and people here will probably know about this better than I and can correct me if I make a mistake. But uncertainty and emotional arousal appear to affect the brain similarly. So if you are in a state of uncertainty, and this is something you can kind of intuitively understand, if you're in a state of uncertainty, you have anxiety. You have anxiety, your emotions get stirred up. Emotional arousal may correlate to aggression. There's an interesting study that says that personal uncertainty, when things are uncertain in your life, you're more likely to stand up to defend your religion if your religion is being criticized or attacked. There's a study that I haven't fully absorbed yet, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but there's sort of an argument that violence in certain ethnic conflicts is forensic. Basically, if you know, if you're killing somebody, if you have killed somebody, you can know that they're in the out-group. This is not, you know, this is the next phase of what I'm going to look at. So I'm not putting any of this out as a kind of conclusive thing. What I think I am saying is that uncertainty identity theory, this idea that uncertainty leads people to join extremist groups, has some empirical support. And it may correlate to things that happen in the brain. And it may also correlate, it may combine this idea of brain activity and narratives. So there was a question earlier about narratives, who cares about narratives, you know, and these narratives are intertwined with what's happening in the brain. So, you know, however you want to perceive it, whether you think it's, you know, the narrative is causing something in the brain or the brain is developing the narrative, there seems to be some correlation. So, extremist groups can exploit this dynamic. So, first off, they can foment uncertainty in the eligible in-group. And the Islamic State has been particularly good at that in Syria and Iraq. So if you're an extremist group, you're ISIS, and you want to get Sunnis in Iraq to join your organization, what you do is you try and spark off a sectarian war, and that's what they did. And it worked to some extent. They were able to recruit off of that. And there were lasting uncertainties that came out of that. So we had an initial wave of sectarian attacks that were sparked by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and with the United States surge and the Western coalition surge in the country, we managed to get that under control with help by recruiting Sunni populations to fight back against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Then, after the withdrawal from Iraq, sectarian uncertainty began. So we had the Maliki regime doing things that put the status of these Sunnis in doubt. So promises were made that weren't kept. There were incidents, there were violent incidents, and it made people worry, and it made them vulnerable to recruitment again. You can foment uncertainty by increasing exposure to violence. So you put out these incredibly violent videos in some cases. You create violence in the environment around somebody. You force people to move, you encourage migration. You can provoke hostility from the outgroup. So that's when you set off this chain reaction of sort of sectarian payback that creates uncertainty in people in the eligible in-group. They're wondering who's going to protect them, how are they going to be safe? And you can disrupt the economy, leaving people wondering how they're going to make a living. You can also exploit existing uncertainty. So you can do that in conspiracy and message. If people have doubts, you can try and aggravate those doubts. If there are fracture lines in a society, you can try and hit those lines. You can use a terrorist attack to try and aggravate those fractures. You can promote conspiracy theories, which we're seeing a lot of in the United States right now. You can increase the virtual exposure to violence by distributing the content on the internet. You can frame your society as being caught in an eternal war. You can target people who have been relocated. And it's kind of interesting, we've had a lot of discussion about refugees, and what we see, I think, is that, you know, refugees are more useful as targets for these groups than as recruitment, but we're in the middle of a long process, and I don't want to overstate my confidence on that. You target converts. So we've seen that a lot with jihadist movements. You target a convert who's somebody who's a seeker. A lot of times we'll see in particularly people in the West who join these movements have been bouncing around looking for something in their lives because they have uncertainty about themselves, and they try a couple of different religions on, and then they find Islam, and then these guys find them. You say, okay, this is somebody who's got this fundamental uncertainty, and they need a narrative that provides more certainty, so we're going to give it to them. And you can target the vulnerable, and we see a lot of that, particularly lonely people. The Islamic State likes to target people who are in matrimonial websites looking for love. So all of this, you know, leads back to the narrative. So you do all these things, you target people who have uncertainty, you try and create uncertainty where there was none, and then you offer this group that provides certainty, and it has this narrative that describes its history, its practices, its expectations for the future. You're trying to give this reduction in uncertainty to people so that they will join the group. And Hobbes' research does suggest that that is a very effective way of recruiting people. So this is just, I wanted to add on, when we get into this discussion of certainty and uncertainty, ultimately an extremist movement that becomes violent does so because it has characterized the outgroup as a threat. So the type of threat is directly related to how much you filled in all the boxes on this narrative. So if somebody says, you know, I believe that homosexuality is morally wrong, that belief might offend you, but you're not necessarily worried about it. If you say, I believe homosexuality is morally wrong and it should be outlawed, then you start to get concerned and you start to see that group as a threat. If they say it should be, we should stone people who are gay, then that escalates the threat. So as the description of the outgroup gets filled in to include past behavior, this is what they've done in the past, so we have every reason to think they're going to do it again, and future expectations, meaning we you know, whether it's an analysis, we've done the demographics, and these refugees are going to make white people a minority in America, or whether it's an apocalyptic religious prophecy, as the Islamic State relies on, the threat is tied to the description. The bigger and bolder the description, the bigger the threat can become. And then the action that the group will take is based on that description. So one reason I want to talk about this in terms of extremism and not just violent extremism is that there's a spectrum. If you think, as the British Israelists did, that Jewish people are basically okay and we're all going to be united at the end of time, then you have an expectation of assimilation. You don't see a threat. You think you're going to be assimilated. You're not really doing anything about it. The solution that you're offering is not that robust. So if you think, as the British Israelists came to believe, that Jewish people are engaged in a conspiracy theory with communists to take over the world, then you see them as a major threat, and then you start thinking about, well, what are we going to do about this? We're going to segregate the population. We're going to carry out violence against them. We're going to arrest them and intern them, or in some cases, we're going to exterminate them. So the other thing that the British Israelists did over the course of time in all these many, many books is they responded to their critics. So you can imagine that this idea that the British are actually the chosen people of God might encounter some resistance from mainstream Christian theologians, from people who were not Anglo-Saxons. And so there was a lot of pushback. And what you can see in their text is that they respond to that pushback directly. So when somebody says, this is complete nonsense because here's a reason, then they will come back with a new justification and say, okay, well, you know, we've done more research and here's a new source of information that gives us a reason that we're right and you're wrong. So they come up with a new justification. And that new justification then forms the basis for a new demand. So it's like, okay, well, the British Israelists couldn't be the lost tribe of Israel because the Jews are are Israel. Jews are the state of Israel, therefore the British can't be the state of Israel. So then the British Israelists started to find ways to delegitimize the Jews. So they went back and concocted these explanations out of scriptures that said, here's why the Jews are not legitimately the heirs of Israel. They are not the chosen people of God anymore because they did this and they did that. And then that new justification led to new demands. So it's okay, well, they're not the chosen people, so that means we're especially important. Then in the 1940s, suddenly there's a state calling itself Israel that's a Jewish state, and that's a huge problem for British Israelists. So they've got to come up with even more dramatic reasons, prophecies. There's prophecies that there's going to be a false state of Israel and that we're all going to fight them in the apocalypse. So this back and forth challenge and justification cycle can be something that I think is particularly problematic in how Western governments have approached the problem of jihadism, because we have frequently tried to directly challenge the legitimacy of jihadist groups and just say, well, they're not real Muslims, and you say things like that, and they come back with new justifications to show why they are real Muslims. They do more scholarship, and I think that there's a risk of escalation when you go at this in a very direct way and tangential to this talk, I think there are other ways to approach it in terms of trying to undermine the message. So socially, so the rise of social media, I've been asked to sort of talk about this a little bit, and it is relevant to this. This cycle of justification and challenge can be increased on social media. So social media is a big pressure cooker where everybody's arguing with each other, going around in circles. So I think it is not entirely coincidental that we saw the rise of the Islamic State model of extremism going hand in hand with the rise of social media and with the adoption of social media by jihadist groups. You get a certain amount of peer-to-peer transmission of ideology. So ideology in the age of social media isn't just about the books and the lectures, although those continue to be very important. It's also about the conversation. So you get somebody like Junaid Hussain, who's a British citizen who joined ISIS and was very active online recruiting people. And you would get into private conversations with them and convince them to join the group, convince them to take action against people in their own countries. And that peer-to-peer transmission eventually funnels you back to the group's doctrinal ideology. So, you know, the peer-to-peer transmission can tailor itself to the person you're talking to. You tell them what they want to hear, you emphasize the things you want to hear. The group's ideology continues to be an anchor, but there's a lot of mutation around the edges. Some of those mutations will move into the center and change the group's ideology ultimately, but a lot of them are just opportunistic. So it helps a group like the Islamic State goes out and can really individually tailor what it's doing to address whatever uncertainty that's in a person's particular life. We're seeing a lot of this with the more mutative power of this with what we call the alt-right in the United States right now, where this is a group that its community is primarily online, and as a result, it's very difficult to pin down a specific ideology. It's really like a umbrella group for many kinds of antisocial beliefs and behaviors. Eventually, my theory is, it's going to have to coalesce around building an identity in the same way that these other groups did. Right now, there's a huge amount of internal conflict, and it's not clear exactly what that will be or how long it might take. And then finally, contagion, and this is, you know, essentially all of these ideologies are really transmitted by some form of personal contact. So you can read a book and adopt an ideology, but you generally aren't going to join an organization without having personal contact. So the fact that you can have personal relationships with people all over the world in real time is just a dramatic factor in allowing these groups to quickly spread. And there are various factors underneath that. One of them in particular is that you can have, it used to be 100 years ago, 50 years ago, if you wanted to join a violent extremist group, you had to go spend time with violent extremists. You had to put yourself at personal risk. You would have some fear of doing that because you didn't know what these guys were capable of. Now you can have very safe conversations with violent extremists that are only become unsafe at the end. So there's much more opportunity for the ideas to spread, for you to get you know, a real recruitment pitch that comes out of this. So all these narrative tools, all these charts, everything I've been talking about, are ways that the extremist group provides certainty. So they provide certainty about who you are, and they provide certainty about where you live in the group. They provide certainty about who the other group is by building out this long narrative. They provide certainty about what you should do. We've made a threat assessment, and here's the kind of action you need to take. They sometimes, in propaganda, will address specific sources of uncertainty, and you can see that in the Islamic State's propaganda. They will put out these magazines that will address the situation in a particular country and show how their approach helps reduce uncertainty. You frame the present very robustly between the past, which is ever expanding and receding behind you and provides a kind of continuity to a very uncertain future. It's an anchor. So if we're going to try and counter this stuff, I think we need to change some of the approaches that we've been engaging in up until now. I think that one thing that is a real issue right now, especially in the United States, especially in France, is uncertainty about how we're going to treat immigrants, how we're going to treat Muslims in this country. What are the laws going to be? What will people expect? It's not just about discrimination. So like reducing discrimination is a good thing. We should do it because it's a good thing. But if we're thinking about how this plays into extremism, people don't want to feel like the sands are constantly changing under them. I think that's a problem that maybe we could do something about or try. We offer clearer narratives. This is difficult in a multicultural society with a political party system. There's a lot of different views about what our group is. So if you're going to be an American, you're going to be French, what does that mean? Not everybody agrees on what that means. The more we can agree on it, the more we can compete. Actions, specific sources of uncertainty when we see a disruption. So, you know, the State Department's been approaching this problem by instituting aid programs all over the world. Again, doing development aid in the third world, I think is something we should do because it's a good thing to do. We shouldn't do it because we expect it's going to reduce extremism. What we can do is look at places that have had huge disruptions and try and anticipate when those disruptions are going to cause extremism and see how we can make those situations more stable. In terms of individuals, I've been thinking about this a lot, but I haven't fully fleshed out what all this means for de-radicalization, for interventions. So there's a very big, or has been up until the most recent US presidential election, there's been a big focus on how do we deal with people before they join a terrorist group. How do you stop somebody from becoming a terrorist? How do you provide aid to a family who has a kid who's dabbling in this stuff? And so I think one thing that maybe we haven't approached that much is how do you, you know, teach people to be comfortable with uncertainty. Don't just go in and resolve uncertainty for them, but teach them to live with it. I don't know what happens life after death. I've learned to live with that. I'm comfortable with not knowing. Other people might be able to be comfortable with that too. So there's a lot of research questions that come out of this, and it's going to keep me busy for a long time. And so here are some of them. One is that I think that the uncertainty identity theory developed by Haag offers the opportunity for us to consolidate a lot of everybody in the counterterrorism and countering violent extremism fields. I think we all have our particular row to hoe, and we often go out and we talk about these things as being, you know, looking for the skeleton key, looking for the master approach. One thing I like about the uncertainty identity theory approach that Haag has put forward is that it encompasses a lot of these things. So it's not just, you know, terrorism is not about having a political grievance, but it may be about having a political grievance that creates a lot of uncertainty in your life, and you're looking for stability, and you're looking for a way to resolve that uncertainty. The same with religious belief. Religion, you know, we get into huge arguments about this in my field all the time. Religion, is religion cause extremism, or you know, does ISIS represent Islam and this kind of thing? And the answer, I think, is that religion is obviously very important. It's the content that fills up this framework that I've been talking about. But it's not the same for everyone, and there are similar groups that are not religious in orientation, but still have a lot of the same traits as an extremist group. So all these things, I think the combination of this ladder of identity construction and uncertainty identity theory, I think you can put them together and you can encompass a lot of the things that everybody has been talking about. So we're not throwing out all the great research that's been done on each of these individual kinds of pieces. We're saying they're all connected by this thread of potentially of, you know, things that resolve uncertainty. I think there's also room for, you know, on the neuroscience aspect of this. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I can appreciate what it brings. I think we can look at some questions. There's a resolution. So uncertainty and emotional arousal, there are some studies that suggest they might be connected. What about resolution of uncertainty? What does that do in the brain? If you're given a question, you do a study, you cause somebody to feel uncertainty, and then you give them an answer that resolves that uncertainty. What does that do? Does that create emotional arousal? I think it would. When I solve a crossword puzzle, I feel satisfaction. It gives me a good feeling. I think if my uncertainty is more profound than finding a four-letter word for a wingless seabird, then I think that I'm going to get much more satisfaction out of resolving that. And if you're joining a violent extremist group to resolve uncertainty, and then the rest of the world is declaring total war against that extremist group, is that a self-perpetuating cycle? So are we allowing these groups to create new uncertainty and then use that new uncertainty to recruit again? And then we feed into that uncertainty in the ways, if we respond to it disproportionately or with a whole of society approach. And I think that I don't have answers to these questions yet. I think these are things that I'm interested in exploring. I think that I feel like this is a promising area to look into, and I hope it's a bit of a fresh approach. So, thank you.